So we've had a little introduction to the code first from database model. So now we're going to try and implement it in our application. Now, one thing to note, in the sample we watched, there was no database connection set up in his application already. He used the Entity Framework Designer to add the connection string to the web.config file. We've already done this. When we set up our application back 2 weeks ago, we already created a connection to our database and we called it default connection. So we're not going to need to create a database connection. We already have one. So where do you think we should create? Where should our models go? What part of the project should we run the ADO wizard, Entity Framework Wizard, to generate our models? Yeah, the models folder seems like a pretty obvious place to put them. So if I right-click my models folder and choose add and choose new item. Now you may see ADO.NET Entity Data Model right here. If you do, you can choose it from here. If you don't see ADO.NET Entity Data Model, just pick new item instead. And then we'll find it under Visual C# and Data. It should be the first item in that list. Now, technically, we could call this anything we want. However, and you saw in the video that normally the name of the connection string in the database matches the database class we're creating. So let's call it default connection because that's what our connection string is already called. We'll call this default connection. So this was the old option that we picked, and this is the option you're going to probably use for your assignment 2. But for MVC, we want this, code first from database. So we have an existing database with tables already, but we're leaving the diagram part out of it. So pick code first from database, and let's click next. Which connection do we want to use? Well, in the video, he had to create a new connection. We don't need a new connection. We already have our default connection set up. So I'll just leave that option selected. I'll pick yes, you can include the sensitive data. And I'm going to uncheck this. We don't need to save that connection string to web.config. We already have it in web.config. We don't need 2 copies of the same database connection string. So just leave that as our default connection, pick yes, and click next. Did I change the password on my database? I don't think so. Hold on, let's. This is where it's a really good idea to have our database connection in a little file somewhere. I had taken my password out because I've pushed this up to GitHub and my repository is public, so everyone has access to it. So I had taken out the password in web.config. It's back in there now, so I'm going to have to start again. That's okay. I'll add a new item, choose Visual C# Data, Hopefully this should work now. I'm going to choose code first from database. I don't want to save it to web.config. There. Now that I put my password back in, Gurbesh?
I cannot use code first.
Okay. Who else doesn't get the option? Anybody else not get the option to choose code first?
Says my entity's outdated.
Okay. This option was introduced in Entity Framework 6. Okay, so yeah, if it's showing you're using Entity Framework 5, you don't get that option. You don't get this option. So in that case, hit cancel. And then you need to go into tools and extensions and updates. Are you using Visual Studio 2015? Okay, so in here, if you click online, let's search for Entity Framework. Here, so if you search under online, search for Entity Framework. It's the EF6. I think this is the extension you need. The EF6 code first. Let me just check EF6 and see if there's some other package, if that's. Yeah, I think it's this one, this EF6 code first. So you'll have to install that extension and then probably restart Visual Studio. After you install an extension, it usually asks you to restart Visual Studio. So when you searched online and searched entity or search EF6, you don't get this one? If not, we'll look at it at the break. You still can't find that option. So I got to do it one more time. Oops. I'm going to choose code first, say yes, and uncheck. And now it says, what objects do I want to include? I don't really need the order detail. We're not going to work with that. I'll include album, artist, cart, and genre. If you click all the tables, that's fine. But for sure, we want album and genre at a minimum. We probably want artist as well. So pick all the tables or at least the first 4 tables in the list. And then click Finish. And the wizard will then create several models. It'll create a default connection model that's used for connecting to the database, and it will create a new separate model class for each one of our tables: album, artist, cart, and genre. So it'll take a bit, and each of those models is going to be a C# representation of what that table looks like in SQL Server. So I'll just click Finish here. Gurbesh, did you find that option or no, it never came up? So here's what we get. Here is this is basically our class that's used for connecting to the database. So it uses our connection string called default connection. So whatever value we have here, that has to match here. If we named our connection string differently in web.config, we would want to make sure that these 2 values are the same. And this class is part of ASP.NET's DB context. So it means it's a class used for connecting to a database, doesn't do anything else. And within here, it references these other 4 models: albums, artist, cart, and genre. And we can see, you kind of mentioned this in the video, it sets up some of the rules here. So for example, that the album price has to have 2 decimal places. And the relationship between an album and an artist. So these things are generated automatically based on our database schema. If we go and look at our models, so not only did we get a default connection, but we now have, well, here's the genre model that we're going to work with. So genre has albums. It's a one-to-many relationship. One genre can have many albums. And it sets out the field names, ID, name, description, with the data types. It even reads the length of those character fields in the database. So it won't, for example, allow us, if our model won't allow us to create a genre name with more than 120 characters. It'll perform validation. It won't allow us to save a value longer than that. So all of these models get generated automatically by that wizard. So here's our album. So we don't really need to touch these files. We can make changes to them if we need to, but we shouldn't have to. We'll just work with them as they are. So these models now represent the different tables in our database. And just like when we used Entity Framework before, they also will include built-in methods for doing create, read, update, and delete. We don't have to write any of our own functions to do those things. We just call the methods that are built into our model. Anybody not able to get their models built? Getting an error? Okay, well, you should try to connect to your own database now if you can, rather than mine. If you can, Akash, see if you can connect to your own if you have the Music Store database set up. Either locally or on Azure, either one. It'll run faster on your local SQL server. So now that our models are set up, what we're going to do after we have a quick break, when we come back, we want to connect up our controller to talk to our model, be able to run a query and get some data, and then we want to pass that data back to our view and change the data that shows up on our view. And we want that to actually come from our database instead of our hard-coded array. So let's take a break here. A couple of you are having issues. I can come have a look. If you're having an issue, we'll come back at 5 after 9.